What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the August 2021 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. We've had so many events conclude the prior month. We had Remote Duel YCS taking place all around the world. North America, Europe, Central America, South America. Everyone was just playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Last month, and it was absolutely fantastic. So we actually have a lot of data to sift through this time around, and so let's go ahead and dive right in. So kicking things off at number 5, the 5 slot's always a little bit tricky, right? Because I feel like it's pretty easy to identify and isolate what the best like 2 to 4 decks are most of the time, but the 5th one's always a bit of a wild card. And so with that in mind, I am going to go with Sky Striker as my number 5 pick. Now, this is a bit weird, but I'm going to try to defend this as best I can. So first of which, Sky Striker has a 50% win rate in the online environment, which doesn't really seem that impressive. However, it is the second most represented deck online, and that is something that matters because in terms of occurrence of how often you're going to encounter the deck, that means you're going to be seeing it quite a bit. And one of the reasons why I want to put an asterisk there is because I think there's also a sizable amount of players who try to play Sky Striker who may not play it fully optimally, and as a result are dragging down the win rate, because Sky Striker is a very particular deck that you have to play near perfectly to get the full value of its potential, and if you don't, it's a very punishing deck in that regard. And so as a result of that, I think the numbers are a bit skewed here, even though its results may say otherwise. In terms of top cut representation for all of the Remote Duel YCS, the Sky Striker showed up a little bit. In terms of North America, it took up 4 of the top 32 slots, which is actually pretty impressive, but for Central and South America, it only had 1 in 32 and 16 for Central and South America respectively, and then in Europe, it actually had 0. So not exactly good on that front, but again, when you see the overall breakdown from these tournaments, there was a lot of Sky Striker contention, and it was one of the decks that people were actually encountering the most as they made their way to the top tables. I did consider putting Invoke Shaddoll as the number 5 pick because it does have a much better win rate coming in at about 56%, which is pretty statistically significant when you look at it versus Sky Striker. And also in terms of overall representation, while North America and Europe, it didn't really see that much play, Central and South America, it actually took up the 2nd or 3rd most represented spot in the top cuts, which is much more sizable than say Sky Striker overall, but I would say about even when you look at them all in the aggregate. However, the representation for how many players are actually on Invoke Shaddoll is much lower by comparison compared to how many players are on Sky Striker. Invoke Shaddoll like maybe just barely cracks the top 10 decks being played at the moment, and Sky Striker is the 2nd most played deck. So you have to take those sort of calculations into account when you're figuring what the best deck actually is. And so while the two decks are a bit even in terms of their overall top cut representation, depending on the regions that you're looking at, I think Sky Striker actually has some fairly decent matchups when we look at the rest of the decks we're going to be talking about on this list. And also the fact that Sky Striker, I think once again, when Sky Striker is in the right hands, I think it has the potential to go much further than people might give it credit for. You can honestly say that for any deck, but I think it's particularly important with Sky Striker that your technical play is on point, because typically the players that do the best with Sky Striker are the ones that you always seeing do the best with Sky Striker. They are very consistent across the board and are consistently seen as some of the top players in the game. And so as a result of that, that's why I put Sky Striker in as my number 5 slot. It may not have the highest win rate, and it may definitely have its faults, but it's going to be a deck you're going to encounter online a lot, and that actually matters quite a bit. But coming in at number 4, we have the first deck that actually managed to take down winning one of the Remote Duel YCSs, and that deck is Prank Kid. Shoutouts to Pack for winning the North American Remote Duel YCS with his Prank Kid build. I'll have that up on the screen so you guys can go ahead and take a look. But Prank Kid is a deck that actually did see reasonable representation across the board as well. Not only did it take up 2 of the top 32 slots in North America, it took up 5 of the top 32 in South America, 4 of the top 16 in Central America, and then only 1 of the top 32 in Europe. Now, it really isn't much of a surprise to see a deck like Prank Kid take one of these events, because obviously Prank Kid has been one of the best decks for the better part of the past several months, right? And that's due to the fact that it has a very consistent 1-card engine that typically gets everything online. You can set up a very formidable board with Battle Butler if you're going first, and if you're going second, the Prank Kids are actually pretty decent at link climbing and cracking opponents' boards because you're able to go into cards like Access Code Talker and win the game on the spot. The deck actually has a very formidable grind game, and while it can get blown out by specific cards like Nibiru, depending on how people decide to assess the format as to whether or not specific cards that may blow out Prank Kids are prevalent or not, that's where a deck like this can have the opportunity to shine. And maybe players identified that this was an opportunity that players weren't expecting Prank Kid to do as well as it could have, and that is where players like Pack were able to capitalize. Prank Kids currently sit at a 59% win rate in the online environment, and anytime you're getting close to 60%, that is the hallmark of one of the best decks of the format. Prank Kids at times can be a little bit glass cannony, and like I said, can get blown up by specific cards like Nibiru and the like. However, it didn't stop Pack from winning, so congratulations for that. And it didn't stop a bunch of other players from making the top cut and having their chance at winning these Remote Duel YCSs as well. So Prank Kids isn't going anywhere. It's a deck you definitely need to have your eye on. And so for those reasons, that's why we have Prank Kids coming in at number 4. Now coming in at number 3, we have yet another deck that has managed to hold a 59% win rate online and absolutely dominated in terms of top cut representation across all the Remote Duel YCSs, and that deck is of course Virtual World. I'll go ahead and throw up a Virtual World list so you guys can take a look for yourself to see what the Virtual World decks are starting to look like. But when you look at the breakdowns of the top cut representation for all of these Remote Duel YCSs, it took up 4 of the top 32 slots for North America, 3 of the top 32 for South America, and 4 of 32 for Europe as well. Not only is it able to have a 59% win rate, it's not just one of the most represented decks, but it's one of the decks that's winning the most as well. Now, while Virtual World didn't take home the gold from any of these Remote Duel YCSs, it does still have a very important role in this format, and that is because of the way it lines up against some of the other strong decks. And that is because they have a card like Shen Shen, which is able to be a floating macrocosmos, making sure that cards are going to get banished instead of getting sent to the graveyard. That's going to matter especially not just for some of the other decks that we've discussed prior to this, but also for the number 2 and number 1. And by having a Shen Shen also backed up by something like Chuche, sometimes that's just enough to shut down a lot of these decks straight out of the gate on turn 1. But Virtual World is also this sort of combo control deck of sorts as well, where it's able to go off when it needs to, but most of the time it's very happy fighting for the board, trying to establish all of its best cards and be able to really just get a foothold on the game so that way it chokes the opponent out of resources and play the game that it truly wants to play. But when it needs to turn it to 11 and go in for the big damage, it's capable of doing that as well. Some of the Virtual World boards are nasty, and this is a deck that, even though it has lost True King of all Calamities, it's a deck that has still consistently been one of the best decks of the format since that banning, and will probably continue to be so for the next several months. Now, the deck at times can be a little bit clunky and suffer from some awkward hands because you really just need a bunch of Virtual World cards to really make your plays all come together, and if you don't get the right combinations of cards at times, the deck can suffer from some consistency issues, and it can lose to itself sometimes more than to the opponent, and that's just really unfortunate. But that hasn't stopped the deck from maintaining that 59% win rate that we talked about at the beginning, and honestly, I don't see Virtual World going anywhere anytime soon. It's probably going to maintain its foothold in the format as one of the top dogs, and so for those reasons, that's why we've got Virtual World coming in at number 3. But coming in at number 2, what can be better than the deck with the 3rd most representation from all the Remote Duel YCSs and the deck with the 2nd most representation? So it makes sense that it's taking up the number 2 slot, and that deck is of course Drytron. I'm gonna have a deck list up here again for your guys' reference if you want a template to be able to try the deck out for yourself. Drytron is a deck that, thanks to the brand new set and introducing cards like Diviner of the Heralds as well as Moo Beta Fafnir, it has taken the deck to new heights. Not only did it win the South American Remote Duel YCS courtesy of Andreas Torres, but it also took up 5 of the top 32 from North America, 4 of the top 32 from South America, and 7 of the top 32 slots from Europe. So you can imagine that Drytron was just everywhere, having the 2nd most representation across all top cuts of all the Remote Duel YCSs. When this is one of the most competitive and prestigious events we have during this time of remote dueling, you know that this deck is definitely a force to be reckoned with. Drytron is of course the combo deck of choice for the format, and the reason for that is the boards that Drytron is able to assemble on turn 1, especially if it goes uninterrupted, are seemingly unbeatable at times. When you're staring down a Herald of Ultimateness that has like 4 to 6 negations depending on how many cards your opponent has in hand, courtesy of Beatrice detaching and sending Eva to the graveyard to reload your hand for next turn full of Diviners and Heralds of Orange Light, plus back that up with protection from IP Masquerena to go into stuff like Nightmare Unicorn. I mean, when you have all these different things going on, not to mention Herald of Orange Light can potentially protect you from your opponent's hand traps in engine on top of it, the deck is just absurd. It's incredibly explosive and actually probably has the best win rate when it goes first unopposed of any other deck in the format. Now, obviously, people are aware that this deck is incredibly strong. We've known that since the release of Diviner and Moo Beta Fafnir, and so players have had to accommodate their main and side decks appropriately to be able to combat the Drytron menace. And as a result, that's what's kept Drytron relatively in check, although it is one of the strongest decks of the format. Some people might argue it is the strongest deck of the format just because some players view that the best deck is able to get as many free wins as possible. And when you're playing a deck like Drytron, you can assemble your turn 1 board with relative ease, then you're going to be picking up games left and right without having to spend much time. So as a result, Drytron is my number 2 pick, but it may be number 1 in your eyes. I really love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments because that's always a fascinating discussion. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 meta deck of the competitive August 2021 format. And if you haven't already figured it out, I don't know where you've been the last several months, but this deck has been on a tear. And if anything proved that this is the best deck of the format in my eyes, it was these results. That deck is Brigade. Yes, Brigade, ladies and gentlemen, was absolutely everywhere throughout the course of the Remote Duel YCSs. I'll put a list up here of one of the first place lists because not only did it win the European YCS, it also won the Central American YCS as well. It had the highest representation in Top Cut with 6 of 32 in North America, 7 of 32 in South America, 6 of 16 in Central America, and 13 of 32 in Europe's Top Cut. That's almost 1/2 of the Top Cut dedicated solely to Brigade, and Raphael Nevin was able to take the European YCS with Brigade. Congratulations to him, and Brigade has just been on an absolute tear as of late. It's funny because some people were questioning with the banning of Drytron whether or not that was going to affect Brigade's performance, but honestly it doesn't, because the Zodiac cards are still pivotal for just being able to go into Zeus, and that's a payoff enough. Without Drytron, you can't do some of the other cute plays that the Brigade Zodiac deck was able to do before, but honestly some players are choosing to forego the entire Zodiac engine altogether. I believe actually in the European YCS specifically, there was 6 Zodiac variants of Brigade, and there's actually 6 pure variants of the deck, and I think even an Ancient Warriors build on top of it that managed to make it. So there's even diversity within the archetype as well, and I just think that's fantastic. One of the reasons that Brigade is such a powerful deck is the fact that it's able to be so incredibly efficient with its resources. The fact that it actually can play a very long grind game, and while it doesn't make necessarily the most intimidating boards compared to a deck like Drytron, and since the engine is able to recycle itself almost entirely thanks to Brigade Revolt while also putting up an interruption during the opponent's turn of a non-targeting, non-destructive banish, that's a pretty big threat for any deck to be able to deal with. Another reason why Brigade is so powerful is that similar to past decks like Salamangreat, Sky Striker, and Zodiac in their respective formats, Brigade's engine is very condensed, and so as a result, you're able to specifically tech out the deck for whatever the meta may be throwing at you. Maybe you want defensive cards in the form of traps for when you're going first. Maybe you want a just handful of hand traps for when you know you lose the die roll and you're going up against these other combo decks like Prank Kid or Drytron. There's a lot of flexibility in the deck, and I think that's what a lot of players like because the engine is already so powerful at recurring itself and just constantly putting pressure on the opponent. Not to mention it can make Axis Kotaker very easily to end games rather quickly, but then being able to then tech out the deck to your flavor to be able to identify whatever maybe the other best decks of the format might be and then appropriately act and then take advantage of that. That's one of the reasons why Brigade is one of the best decks, because other decks just don't have that luxury. Brigade's been like one of, if not the best deck in the TCG for like the past several months, and so it's really no surprise to see that the deck is continuing to do well and have just such a dominating performance at the Remote Duel YCS. A lot of the top players felt that Brigade was 100% the best deck to be taking into the Remote Duel YCS atmosphere, and not only did it have the highest top cut conversion, but it's also one of the most represented decks as a whole when you look at the overall breakdowns, and also one of the most represented decks online. I think it might be the 3rd or 4th most played deck, so the likelihood of you coming across this deck is very high, which means you need to be prepared to come across it whether you're playing at a locals, maybe a larger tournament like a Remote Duel YCS or a Remote Duel Invitational Qualifier, or maybe if you're just playing online on any of the online platforms. Brigade's going to be here for a while, and so you definitely need to be prepared. So it's no surprise that Brigade is my number 1 meta deck of the competitive August 2021 format. I'd really love to hear what you guys think though down in the comments, so be sure to let me know what you guys think. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive early one-day access to the Yu-Gi-Oh progression series, The History of Yu-Gi-Oh, and Yu-Gi-Oh Sealed Showdown. Thank you all so much for watching the video, and we will see you next time.